So what is it that makes you, you? It's that special blend of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, right? That's your personality. But what happens when those patterns get so rigid, so stuck, that they start causing some serious problems in your life? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Look, we all have our things. Maybe you're super organized. Maybe you're always the life of the party. Those are just quirks. But here's the big question we're tackling. Where's the line? At what point does a personality trait stop being just a quirk and cross over into a pattern that causes real distress and dysfunction?
To get to the bottom of that, we first have to get on the same page. So in this first part, we're going to lay out the blueprint. What experts actually mean when they use the term personality disorder.
Okay, so what is a personality disorder, officially? I want you to think of your personality as a sort of blueprint for how you engage with the world. For most of us, that blueprint's kind of flexible. We can adapt. But with a personality disorder, it's like that blueprint is set in concrete. It's rigid, it's unchangeable, and it leads to ways of being that just don't work well in the world. The two words you really got to remember here are long-lasting and inflexible.
Yeah, this isn't about having a bad week or even a bad year. We're talking about these really deep, ingrained patterns that touch pretty much everything. This means rigid ways of thinking you can't snap out of, emotional reactions that seem way out of sync with the situation, and sometimes real trouble with impulse control. These patterns usually show up when you're young, they stick around for the long haul, and, this is key, they cause major disruptions in the big areas of life, like your job, your friendships, and your relationships.
All right, now that we have a definition, how do we start to organize all these different patterns? Well, to make sense of it all, professionals group personality disorders into three main categories, or what they call clusters, based on traits they have in common. First up, you've got Cluster A. You can kind of think of this as the odd or eccentric bunch. The common theme here is behaviors that might seem a little strange to other people. This cluster includes patterns built around deep suspicion of others, a real detachment from social relationships, or even just some peculiar thoughts and beliefs.
Next is Cluster B, which you might think of as the dramatic or emotional cluster. If I had to pick one word here, it would be instability. These patterns often involve a lot of impulsive behavior, really intense and chaotic relationships, maybe an overwhelming need to be the center of attention, or a serious lack of empathy for others.
And finally, we have Cluster C, the anxious or fearful cluster. As you can probably guess, this one is defined by high levels of anxiety. This can show up as extreme social avoidance, a profound need to be taken care of by others, or an intense, all-consuming focus on orderliness and control. And that last one? Well, that brings us to something really important that we need to clear up.
Okay, this is a super common mix-up, so let's break it down. Obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, OCPD, is not the same thing as OCD. With OCPD, the perfectionism and the need for control are woven into the very fabric of a person's personality. They often see their way as the right way. OCD, on the other hand, is an anxiety disorder. It involves unwanted, intrusive thoughts, obsessions, and the repetitive behaviors or compulsions that a person does to try and ease their anxiety. And very often, people with OCD are painfully aware that their rituals don't really make sense.
So this begs a massive question, right? Where do these deep-seated patterns even come from? Well, the truth is, there's no single, easy answer. It's more like a complex puzzle. Let's take a look at the root causes.
It really boils down to a mix of things. For one, there's a biological piece. Genetics can play a role, and even the physical structure of your brain can be a factor. Then you have environmental factors. Stuff like trauma in childhood, neglect, or just growing up in a really unstable environment can have a huge impact. And finally, there are psychological factors, like ways of coping that you learned as a little kid to survive. But those same strategies just aren't helpful anymore as an adult, and they become rigid.
Understanding where they come from is one thing. But maybe the most important question of all is, what can be done about it? And this is where the hope comes in. Because while these are chronic conditions, they are absolutely manageable. So let's look at the path to treatment.
First things first, getting a proper diagnosis is not a quick process. It's incredibly thorough. A mental health professional will do really detailed interviews and watch how a person's patterns play out over a long time. It's not a snapshot. It's about seeing the whole movie. And they use the established criteria in what's known as the DSM-5 to make an accurate diagnosis.
So the goal of treatment isn't some magic cure. It's about management, but improving someone's quality of life. And the absolute heart of treatment is long-term psychotherapy.
This can look like cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which helps people identify and change those destructive thought patterns. Or it could be dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, which is fantastic for teaching skills to handle overwhelming emotions. And while medication can't fix the disorder itself, it can be a huge help for managing related symptoms like depression or severe mood swings.
Whew! We have covered a ton of information. So, before we wrap this up, let's just boil it all down to the absolute most important things to remember from all of this. If you take away anything today, let it be this. First, personality disorders are serious, chronic conditions, but they are manageable. Second, psychotherapy is absolutely central to that management. It's the main event. Third, getting help early can make a world of difference for how someone's life unfolds. And finally, never, ever underestimate the power of a good support system from family and friends. It's vital.
And that kind of brings us to our last thought. Learning about the complexity behind all this, it isn't just an academic thing. It's a challenge to us, really. It challenges us to look beyond frustrating behaviors and see the deep-seated pain that might be underneath. It asks us to think about how a little more understanding could lead to a whole lot more empathy in our everyday lives. Thanks for digging into this with us.